All right, we can get started. Welcome everyone on this slightly rainy Sunday, but a lovely time to talk about art and look at some. So I'm excited. Welcome everyone to our programming for our exhibition, The Five Contemporary Iowa Landscape Artists. I recognize some of you and our participants, which is wonderful. And we are kicking off what is going to be a series of 5 chats with the artists who are in this exhibition, just briefly and informally talking about their work and what informs it and kind of how they got here. So I'm excited to do these. And we are starting off with a very lovely one with Stan Wiederspan, who will be talking about Larry Zirbel, who unfortunately passed away in 2019 and is not able to be here to talk about his own work. But I can think of no one better to sub in for him than Stan, who is a longtime friend and co-conspirator and encourager of Larry's work. So just to give you a little brief introduction, Stan, our speaker, has a very long history in the Cedar Rapids art scene. He moved to Cedar Rapids in 1973 after studying at the University of Iowa and teaching at Iowa Wesleyan and Mount Pleasant. He's not only been a practicing artist in the local community, but also served as past director of the Cedar Rapids Art Center, which is, of course, now the CRMA, and owned and operated his own gallery. And Stan works in many genres when he creates his art. He does really beautiful landscapes. He does wonderful abstracts. In the early 2000s, he turned his focus to the simple cardboard box, and they were very Caravaggesque and dramatically lit and wonderful. So Stan will be speaking about Larry Zirbel. And Larry was born on May 29th, 1931 in Des Moines, Iowa. Graduated from Roosevelt High School, played basketball and baseball, went to Drake University where he got his Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. Did service in the U.S. Army, began his business career where he worked as an art director for a Des Moines advertising agency, and later as an account executive at the Des Moines Register and Tribune Company. He joined Staymates Publishing in Cedar Rapids in 1957 and began a 37-year career with his company. After retirement, he became a member of the board of directors, served on the boards of lots of local nonprofits, Theater Cedar Rapids, the Cedar Rapids Art Center, but was always really interested in art, obviously. And I will let Stan kind of fill us in on his art career. So Stan, do you want to start telling us with how you met Larry, and how you two like started out together and what brought you together?
Well, as you mentioned, I came to Cedar Rapids in 1973 to be director of the Arts Center at that time. And I think maybe Larry was on the board, I'm not positive, but it was through the Arts Center, of course, that I met him. At that time, the Arts Center had a small sales shop in the lobby, and we also then had paintings available for rent. And I think that's probably where I saw the first Larry Zirbel piece. And so that's the base of my reflection on what he was doing then and has followed through until the things that he's been doing, that he had been doing right up till the time that he died, actually.
And so in the exhibition, of course, I have classified Larry's art as landscapes, but I'm sure they can be read in a lot of different ways. So can you tell us a little bit about, like, was Larry thinking of them as landscapes? Did he have a different interpretation for them?
Well, I've been thinking about that a lot. And the first pieces that I saw, in fact, did very much suggest landscapes. There were larger canvases, perhaps 30 inches square, maybe a little larger. And they all seem to have the same characteristic in that the painted area was concentrated in the center of the canvas. And there was a lot of open space surrounding any painting then that was done in the middle. However, the painted area was somewhat fragmented and then would branch out, so to speak, into the open space. And that configuration has, to a certain extent, followed through much of the rest of his paintings. They all, I think, suggest landscapes, or were certainly landscapes in as a point of departure, having a certain horizontal configuration about them. As I have looked at the pieces that are in the exhibit, there are several that are more specifically landscape, suggesting landscapes, but they never were preoccupied with any specific kind of documentation of horizon lines or any recognizable subject in the landscape. That merely provided the point of departure. And as I reflect on the early pieces, comparing with the more recent pieces, uh, color continued to grow and become more a part of the whole objective. And so I think his experience as a painter grew in his desire to simply work with color and explore color. And the landscape element, while it was always there, began to fade in comparison to somewhat more of an abstract approach.
Mhm. I definitely agree with that. What do you think were Larry's main influences artistically?
That's an interesting question because I don't think that he was particularly influenced by any stylistic factor or any movement. I mean, I know that he had stacks of all of the art journals and, like all of us, enjoyed looking through them. But I think he did so just by way of curiosity of what else was going on. But he was very much his own man, his own artist, and did exactly what he chose to do. I don't think he was ever influenced by any market concerns because he didn't have to sell his art to make a living. He did it out of pure pleasure. And in that way, he was an artist. He thoroughly enjoyed the act of painting. He loved mixing paint. He loved the palette and mixing colors. And then he loved simply the physical act of applying paint to the surface, so that the whole act of painting was really what he was about. And it was a purity. And so in one sense, he really was very much just a pure artist.
And I will bring up some of Larry's pieces that are in our current exhibition.
As you can see the suggestion, obviously, of a horizon line, but anything below that point is difficult to relate to any landscape elements unless you're talking about severe cliffs or rock areas or something like that. But you can see his fascination with color. These colors are somewhat subdued. In other works, they're stronger. This one, which is in the exhibit, is very abstracted. It's easy to suggest, well, we can see some clouds, perhaps storm clouds. On the middle left certainly is some lines and paint that you could say, well, there's the landscape. But the overall look of the piece, I think, is purely abstract. And I think of him as very much of a color field painter,
Mhm.
and that's really what attracted him and what he liked. Uh, as I keep saying, the landscape was gave him a way to start, gave him a way to put marks on the canvas. But once he got into it, then it was the adventure of painting, the adventure of what happens with the color. By the way, in his later works, he had begun using the new water-based oil paints, which sounds like an oxymoron, but there is such on the market. And in this one, you can see a little bit of almost a watercolor effect,
Mhm.
particularly down in the lower right. You can see some blending that looks like it was thinned out.
Mhm.
And of course, you can do that with a paint thinner with oil paints. But this is very typical, I think, of his later work.
When I was selecting these pieces, and Anne, his widow, was incredibly generous with us and allowed us to come back several times and choose our favorites. I did have to double check with her that these were all oils because for a minute I was like, this looks more like watercolor. So that's
Yeah, yeah.
interesting. And
You
the
know,
this last one is my favorite piece that's in our exhibition, just because I love the rich saturated color that he uses in this one.
it's exactly, and you can see that particularly in the lower area, it appears to be washes that he's using. And then we see this linear quality just to the right of immediate center are these horizontal lines. And uh, I guess that's something that he periodically used. Perhaps actually that's a reflection back to some of the earlier paintings where there was this distinct uh, linear quality to them. It's later that he works with the color field. That reminds me, I would compare him as a color field painter with Helen Frankenthaler.
Mm.
I think she, of course, worked on gigantic canvases and painted with mops and sponges and things, whereas Larry continued to simply work with brushes. But uh, looking at this, you can see uh, similarities with Frankenthaler. I don't mean to suggest that he was influenced by her. I think that this just evolved naturally out of his own desire to work with paint and to have the adventure of what can happen with paint as you manipulate it in a variety of ways using a variety of brushes.
Mhm. What was his process like? Like how most of his work that I've seen is on the smaller side. I know he
Right.
does some larger pieces, and we certainly have some larger Zirbels in the museum collection. How quickly did he work? Were these the work of a day, or did they take multiple? What can you tell us about his process?
You know, I never saw him work. I've been in his studio, was in the studio that he was using most recently, and it was a very small area,
Mhm.
and he just squeezed into a space that was about 3 feet wide. I mean, for him to stand in. And on his left was a very large window, so he had good light. And immediately on his right was his work table and his palette. And so he could mix the paints very easily beside him. And I think he liked, as I say, mixing the paint as much as applying it. I mean, perhaps if we saw some of the palettes, they themselves would be little paintings. So I think he had a great joy in painting. And I know that in his studio, He had music playing, he had a couch, he had a stack of magazines, he had a coffee table. So it was a complete environment that he loved to be in. And uh, as I say, I think he was an artist's artist.
That's certainly how he always seemed, and that he just created for the joy of creating. And as you say, just loved spending time with the colors and creating texture and different combinations. And I think that certainly comes across in these works, just the joy in creating and using, colored paint to create these wonderful experiences.
One of the things that should be mentioned is that he had a very happy personality.
Hmm.
We would go off and have coffee, and most of the time we just spent laughing at silly things because he liked life. He certainly enjoyed himself, and I think that comes through in the paintings. The previous piece that you were just showing, the little blue one, that seems to just sort of have the exuberance of energy and excitement and joy, even though the colors are more subdued. Still, I think it's a very, very energetic piece. This actually would be one of my favorites. Yeah.
I agree. This one is really spectacular. And this is maybe about life size that I'm seeing on at least my laptop screen. It's not a large painting, but there's just so much dynamism and motion to it that it is really
So
spectacular.
we handled a lot of his recent pieces when I still had the gallery, and many of them were approximately 4 by 5 inches,
Hmm.
very small, and every little mark of the brush, every stroke became that much more significant because it occupied such a major area in such a small space. I just always thought of those little pieces as little masterpieces.
Hmm.
And anyone who was fortunate enough to have bought some of those really have something to hold on to because they were delightful. By the way, I'm just noticing in the lower left corner is his signature, and it
Hmm.
almost has the character of an Oriental chop signature.
Hmm.
And I think maybe uh, there was an underlying Oriental quality about his work. I don't know that he was particularly influenced by it, but there is that sensibility about them.
Hmm. I could definitely see that. And he has one of my favorite artist signatures. As you say, it's very angular and distinctive, but it's not too big and it doesn't distract from the piece. But
Right, right.
he certainly does have one of my favorites.
I think as people might look at paintings like this, uh, they might try very hard to see this, to see or to find some subject in it.
Hmm.
But as I explained to the lady in the gallery one day who was trying to find subject in an abstract painting, I said, the subject is simply the paint. The subject is the color and the relationships. And sometimes I think it's easy to understand if you compare a painting like this with music. Music is simply an abstract collection of sounds put together in various configurations. And that's what an abstract painting is, just various colors and pigments put together in a variety of ways. And that is the subject unto itself. So just stand back, look at it, and enjoy it for the purity of what it is. And I think that's really what Larry fully understood about the art of painting.
Hmm.
It's just a pure thing by itself. It doesn't need to be an illustration of any other subject to have merit.
Absolutely. His pieces are so wonderfully contemplative, and you really can look at all of them for quite a long time and see different things. I think they're really wonderful in that aspect.
Exactly. So, and for instance, in this piece, you can just isolate little areas, and it becomes a visual adventure all by itself. So you can, it's like listening to a symphony. There are various um, parts of the symphony that have their own personalities. Some are very quiet and melodic. Other pieces are very robust and marching on and very strong. And I often say, just stop and listen to a painting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much to experience in these gems. Mm.
There may be people who wish they could paint. And people used to come into my gallery and say, I wish I could paint it, but I don't know what to do. I don't know how to start. And I just suggested get some paint, a brush and a surface, and start applying paint. Just paint, just the purity of putting paint on the surface. And then you will begin to have the adventure of putting one color next to another color, and that will suggest adding yet another color. And that is painting. You know, we went through the period of early painting in the ancient world where photography did not exist yet. And so artists were obligated to illustrate what they saw. It was artists who did portraits. It was artists who recorded the landscape. It was artists who illustrated the story of battles or religious scenes, because there was no other way to visualize it. Once we got into having photography that could do all those things, the artists were released to do an entirely new kind of work, and that was completely non-objective, that didn't necessarily have to relate to anything visually. It was just purely a statement unto itself. And that's where we have arrived at having all these wonderful, wonderful visual experiences with art.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stan. That was wonderful. Does anyone have any questions about Larry's work?
Hey, Stan, it's Sean. I had a question for you.
Yes.
You mentioned the music was playing in his studio. Did he ever say that the music had a direct bearing on his paintings? That if it was an energetic piece of music, it would become an energetic composition, or was it just music as sort of background inspiration for him in the studio, or was there more of a one-to-one direction?
My sense is it provided a very pleasant background. And that's not to diminish the significance of music, but it provided the background. And I know that he always listened to classical music. Uh, and because classical music is abstract, it can be illustrative, as we know. But I think in his studio, simply created an atmosphere where the pure act of painting could occur without the influence of outside elements that would just not be compatible, with the act of painting. I think he just drifted off into a lovely state. Maybe I'm romanticizing it too much, but I just think that he thoroughly enjoyed it. Good question, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I think the relationship between music and art is so obvious. It's very strong. You know, so I do think I've said to Tim Hankovitz that when I'm at the symphony, I often simply am visualizing it as I'm listening to it. I'm visualizing it because it suggests so many color characterizations.
Mm-hmm. Mike, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. I see it Stan's take is on this. It seemed to me, looking at Larry's work, my love for years, that he was interested in the edges of things. So the edge of one color bleeding into another color. And in that larger piece you showed, it seemed to me that there's all kinds of macro and micro edges there that he was playing with. I don't know if, am I so far off base, Stan, or what do you think?
Well, I know you are particularly sensitive about the edges. I think that's very interesting. I think there periodically is a linear quality that you can see coming out in the stronger suggestion of landscapes. I think he was more interested in area, but I think you're correct in being able to see some interest in a linear pattern, whether it be a color juxtaposed next to another color and the edge that occurs, and playing with it, whether it's a sharp edge or a soft edge, or some of the lines that he puts in it. And I just keep thinking of a lot of those small pieces that we had at the gallery. They were very much about area. But now that you raise that question and thinking back over it, I can see where you see the edges. I think that's a good observation.
Yeah, that is an interesting way to think about his work. Because there is just an interesting blending in a lot of them, especially the three we were looking at.
Right. I think it's important, as we've said, for people to look at paintings, not just by way of any kind of obvious subject that might present itself, but some of the subtleties that occur in the actual painting of it. In Mike's paintings, there's just a lot of abstraction going on, and I love his recent paintings. They're just so bold and magnificent, but it's all the abstract areas in the paintings that I've always loved. I think those are such wonderful parts of them. So it's very good to look at Mike's paintings and then to look at Zirbel's paintings, because there really, now that I think about it, there's a lot of relationship.
Mm-hmm. It's really fun to see them juxtaposed with each other in the exhibition. It was fun to lay out, and it's great to see them hanging side by side.
By the way, on that point, you are to be complimented, and your staff, by the way the exhibition is installed. It's beautifully installed, and you create these juxtapositions. And when I was looking at it earlier, I was particularly mindful that you put Zirbel's beside Mike's pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a relationship that perhaps you were drawing as well, but the size relationship is interesting just on that basis. But the painting, the technical painting of both artists is interesting to observe.
Yeah, I really enjoyed laying the show out. It was a lot of fun to see kind of which paintings spoke to each other and what they were saying. It was a really lovely experience.
It is really such a really a beautiful, beautiful show. It's going to be a very popular show with the public, and people need to get in and see it, you know. And I mean, let me say, by the way, that since all of these artists are local or near local, regional, uh, once again, the museum is doing a great job in presenting local, paying attention to our local and regional artists. And so hats off to you and Sean and the whole staff for making the museum available to artists for all of us to be able to exhibit and then see them. And as I was walking around the show a little earlier, it's just a delight to come back and study it, enjoy it, love it.
That's so nice. Thank you so much, Stan. We appreciate that a lot. It's working with local artists is such a joy every time we do it. So it's obviously it's been a part of our mission for a very long time, and we look forward to it being a part of our mission into the future.
Well, and let me add just one more footnote, and then I'll stop babbling. Uh, I think anyone who looks around would agree that we have a very, very rich collection of artists in Iowa, in eastern Iowa particularly, and in this immediate area. There are just outstanding, outstanding artists who could hold their own in any exhibition area, nationally or internationally. So, they're all excellent artists, and the museum is certainly to be complimented for recognizing that and exhibiting their work. So, as an artist, thank you.
Well, that's very kind of you. But as you say, we have so many amazing artists in the area that it makes it very easy for us. But thank you so much, Stan. That was wonderful. That was great to hear about Larry's work, and I so appreciate you sharing your time with us. And next Sunday, we will be venturing into the wilds of Marcia Wegman's work. So if you enjoyed this, please tune in at the same time next Sunday, and we'll be digging into Marcia Wegman and her wonderful work in pastels. But again, thank you everyone for joining us. And Stan, especially thank you. This was really wonderful to be able to hear more about Larry.
My pleasure.
Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.